serving as a CEO of such an important club like Galatasaray, the first woman to be elected to the executive board of ECA, and the first and only female general secretary of the Turkish Football Federation. Many other firsts, as you can imagine. Then, while what Ebru has done for football is still, in my view, only a fraction of the overall contribution that women can and should make to the entire movement, she undoubtedly represents a role model for all of us, and I truly hope to be able to attend a new webinar 20 years from now, where we can talk about the many Ebrus that will populate global football, because it is a fact, and it is scientific, that any economic and social organization governed by a significant number of women benefits from numerous positive aspects. I would say judgment, legality, fairness, equality, and sustainability. So thank you so much, Ebru, and thanks to the panelists of today, which you will introduce now. Thank you, and have a good webinar.
Thank you, Andrea, for such a flattering introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are joining from. We're delighted to have you on this webinar. And greetings to you from my beloved hometown, Istanbul, although you can't see it in the background. So today, we're obviously going to talk about women's football and the unstoppable growth and what is needed for it to grow even further. And I have some very valuable contributors on the panel. And for a change, I will ask them to introduce themselves and also tell a little bit about how and why they got involved in football. So if I may ask Alex Calvin from FIFPro to start first. What do you do? How did you get involved in football? And, just tell us a little bit about your background, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ebru. So I'm Alex Colvin. At the moment, I am head of strategy and research for FIFPro, which is the global trade union of professional footballers. How I got into my role is quite I guess it was like a bit of a non-linear journey, let's say. So I was a former professional footballer. I played in England and also Europe, and was representative of England up until under 23s level. And I think as my career continued or grew, I guess, was also in parallel to that was the growth of professional football in England particularly. And I think my experiences as an amateur or a non-professional, semi-professional, and also a professional player give me a profound understanding of the discrimination that women experience in football, but also the unequal treatment and unequal conditions in which they experience on a day-to-day basis. And but one of the last clubs that I played for was Liverpool, and it's my team that I support. And the treatment of the players and the conditions that they had was really appalling. Like the field they played on, the access to facilities, the level of coaching, the multidisciplinary teams that surrounded the player, everything that touches the player in terms of their performance was, in my opinion, inadequate. I also was managed by Mark Sampson, who was the England manager, but he was also the Bristol manager before he got the job. And I think that taught me a lot about male privilege in football. And Mark was, at the time, a really troublesome coach, but he was also, having relationships with players who were younger than him, and where it was a really problematic environment. And I remember at the time having nowhere to go because the game had just professionalised, so we didn't have PFA membership. And when I finished playing football, I wanted to understand this phenomenon further. So I studied a PhD, I studied a master's, I studied a PhD. And my master's was the first to examine professional football as work for women in England. And I think to this date, there's been no expansion on the concept of work as for women. And my PhD, although that it was conducted almost 6 years after I stopped playing. A lot of the conditions that players had, in spite of them being fully professional footballers at this time, were as bad or worse than what I experienced. For example, they didn't have any maternity policy, there was no mental health support, there was no welfare support, and there was no player-centric policies that were developed for players. And my PhD was in social policy, and it kind of led me to working at FIFPro because I worked at a university for a little bit, and it just didn't fulfill me in any way because I knew that I was having no effect on actually what needed to be affected, which was the players and the conditions. And there was a job at FIFPro, and I got it, and that was 2.5 years ago, and I've been there ever since. It's a bit of a whirlwind story to me.
Yeah, well, I think it says a lot about how, we're all change makers as a result of maybe some of the lived experiences we had, and how we are determined to hopefully leave a legacy of having contributed to this tremendous change in the industry. And thank you for that wonderful and personal introduction, Alex. I'll go over to Jan so he doesn't feel left out as the minority, let's say, on this panel. Usually it's the other way around. So today we only have one male contributor. And Jan, so please tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in football.
Of course, Ebru, and first of all, thanks to everyone for having me. It's great to be here. Great to be in the minority, and that's absolutely how it should be. Well, my name is Jan. I'm from Switzerland. I'm a lawyer by profession, and I was before thinking, how I got involved in football. When I think back, when we were young as kids in primary school, you had these books that you would give to your best friends, and everyone would write in, my favorite color is blue and my favorite food is this, and then one of the questions would typically be, when I grow up I want to be whatever. And I remember that I used to write a variety of things, but it was always linked to football. So I wanted either to be a football journalist or football doctor, obviously a football player, which surprisingly didn't work out, or a football lawyer. It's a bit scary that at that age I wrote that I want to be a football lawyer. And then time progressed, and at some point I studied law. At that time, maybe for lack of better alternatives, I just studied law, as many people do. And then when I finished my studies, I was a bit unsure, like, what do I want to do? I don't want to work at the court, and lawyers are a bit boring. I'm not sure if I want to do that. And then I realized that actually having studied law is a very good field of studies to get involved in sports. And so I sort of reminded myself of those old times, as cliched as it sounds. I remembered how I actually always wanted to work in football. And that's when I sort of had my focus again on that. And from then on, I think it was boringly linear, actually. I wrote a PhD in football law. I was very lucky that I then got to work for UEFA and for FIFA. Then I went back to private practice for a long time, but was always very close to the football industry and worked sort of, within a sports law in my environment, maybe a bit broader as a lawyer, more also on the commercial side, but always football law, as I say, was very much at the center of my practice. And then at some point, I left private practice and came back to FIFA. That's where I am now. I'm very privileged, very lucky to be in the position of Director of Football Regulatory, which brings, there's a great variety in the things that I do. It also gives me great insight from a regulatory perspective into, the development of women's football, the growth of the game, very important work that we still have to do, but I also think good achievements that we've had already. And here I am.
Thank you. That's excellent. This is the part that I love, actually, because nobody's bios or CVs talk about these kinds of details. And this is what brings us to 3 dimensions as people, right? And shows our passion for being part of this beautiful game and the industry. Over to you, Isabella. Let's hear your story.
Thank you, Ebru. Hello, everyone. My name is Isabella Echeverri. I am originally from Colombia. And how I got involved into football, that's an easy one. I was a professional football player for many, many years. Which is very interesting about my story is that I was part of the development of football, because when I started in Colombia, I was part of this very macho culture, which wouldn't allow women to play. So there was actually a vote in my school that all of the parents have to vote to let me play with the school team because I was a woman, right? Well, I was a girl at the time. But then I started moving forward and I got to the Colombian national team very young. And I played 2 U20 South American championships, and I went on to the absolute team. But then I graduated high school and I had no opportunities to go play abroad because the professionalism of the game was not there yet. So I went to the US and I studied. I did 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees in the US while I was in a scholarship. Because I knew at the time that football was not going to be an option for my future, like a real option for my future, right? So I had to be prepared for what was going to be next. So I finished college and I retired for a year. So I went on and worked. But then all of a sudden I got this big opportunity to go play the Champions League with a Greek team. You know, it was so amateur that a friend called me and said, "You want to come play?" And I was like, hell yeah, I want to go play in the Champions League. Why not? You know? And at the same, so that happened. I went to Greece. I played the Champions League. And before that, I skipped a big part because when I was in college, I went to the Olympics. I played the World Cup. I was part of the Colombian national team for many years. And as Alex said, I also saw all of the inequalities, the lack of investment, the lack of resources, the lack of professional opportunities, and I decided to take on my federation. I released a video saying all of the things that were not okay inside of the Colombian national team. And that led me to a whole new world because I realized how much power my platform had as a football player. And I realized how much power I had as a woman to talk about the issues that we're going to be speaking of here today. So not make it too long, I played till 2022. I finished my career in Mexico after playing in Sevilla for 3 seasons, being the captain of Sevilla. So I could actually play pro for many years. I went to Mexico, I finished my career. I went on to work alongside Alex in FIFA for a year. And I recently moved to Miami to work in the media side of things so I can bring more visibility into women's football because I realize that's also very important for our future. And yeah, that's me really quickly. I hope you understood the story.
Yes, and I guess despite, in contradiction to all 3 of you, I had no intention of working in football. I never dreamed to work in football. I was an investment banker. And in 1999, I started working for an American private equity fund, which the year before had bought Vasco da Gama. And they were looking for a club in Turkey. And we, long story short, ended up buying 20% share in Galatasaray. And on the same day of the signing of the shareholders agreement, I had delivered my second child. My kids are 1.5 years apart. And I was told 3 weeks later that I was fired because I had 2 little kids. So all of the lawyers on this screen probably would have loved to have my case as a discrimination case, you know, to take to trial. But I got a call from the president of Galatasaray. So Alex, like you, I was a diehard fan of the club since I was a little girl. And they asked me if I would become the interim CFO. until I decided what to do next. And I thought about it and I said, why not? Let's leave the court case aside. So that was 1st of January 2001. I walked in the door of the club, and it's been now 24 years that I'm in the football industry. So you can tell that I'm very passionate about it. So let's start talking about the sort of 4 topics that we're going to cover today. The first one is, in your opinion, maybe a 2-3 minute summary on top of what you've said, where you think women's football is right now. What is the state of the art? And so maybe we start with the view of the regulator with Jan, and then move to Isabella as the player, and also Alex trade union. Obviously, I also sit on the board of the English PFA, so I have my opinion as well on that front too. Jan, over to you for a few minutes. How do you think the industry is looking right now for women's football?
Thanks, Eva. I think it's a very, very interesting question. And of course, the short and easy answer would just be, well, it's growing and it's, growth of the game. And we all know that, but the easy answer is often not the best one. So I think from the perspective of the regulator, for many years, when I just look at my own position, for many years, football as the business that we do, that was always just men's football. And the regulatory issues, that came from money being involved and appetite for litigation and all the thousands of cases before the football tribunal, it was a sort of a no-brainer. Well, that's just men's football. And I don't know it exactly, but I would think that for many years also the women's football division within FIFA did not play a huge role, just corresponding to where the level of the game was in terms of its importance, its volume, etc. And now it's very interesting that suddenly there is this additional dimension that we try to regulate, but there's this additional dimension of, well, there's 2 different types of football, if I may, and I'll explain what I mean. Because if we regulate things specifically for women's football, we have to understand much more of the issues of women's football, and often I fail because I'm a man. There are certain things that I don't understand, and I'll give you an example that we are right now working together with all the stakeholders on, hopefully very soon, being able to pass an additional package of amendments of the so-called minimum labor conditions of female football players. I think that's very important. And there are certain topics that were discussed, such as menstrual health, that I as a man couldn't possibly understand. I know what it's about, but that's you know what I mean. There's things that I just don't understand, and it's very interesting to now having to address sort of in parallel things for men's football. There's still the regulatory challenges for men's football or for any type of football, whether male, female, youth, boys, girls. There's sort of the common topics, but there are these specificities. Now that's extremely interesting. And then what I would also say is a specific challenge is that we want to regulate in support of the growth of the game. We want to regulate specifically to tackle certain things that are maybe unique to women's football, to professional women's football. And sometimes you want to regulate to incentivize certain things or to move in a certain direction. But it's also always a very fine balance that you have to strike, because if we say we think there should be additional layers of legal protection for female professional players that can have a variety of shapes and forms, we would all agree that's good. But if you go too far and if you want to be too progressive, I am sure there will be clubs that will suddenly say, well, then we cannot afford to have a women's football team.
Yeah.
And so we will stop having women's football. And then you score an own goal, to use football language. And that's sometimes a very fine balance to strike. And also when we have all the very good discussions with, FIFPro, ECA, UEFA, World Leagues, there's obviously conflicting views and conflicting interests, and within that, to strike that balance is a fascinating challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think a live example right now is Belgian Women's League, where a couple clubs already pulled out because they found the new requirements, licensing requirements, to be too onerous, and because it wasn't accompanied by additional distributions from the Belgian FA, they said they simply cannot, afford to abide by it, and pulled out. So you're right. And I think as a regulator, but also as kind of the biggest funder of the game, FIFA has played a significant role in leading the investment. But of course, there is still such a big gap for and need for investment. Isabella, from your point of view, where do you see women's football currently? We've come a long way. I remember I was asked to give a keynote speech in 2015 at the World Cup final, just before the World Cup final in Vancouver, to talk about the commercial potential of women's football. And a lot of people thought that I was way too optimistic in my predictions, but I think even I have been proven wrong, let's say. Even I was conservative, considering the kind of growth that we have witnessed over the last 3 cycles, basically. So over to you, Isabella.
I played in that World Cup in Canada.
Oh, great.
Which was great. But yeah,
some of us talk, others play, right? I'm good at talking, not playing.
Well, from a player perspective, I believe that the landscape of women's football today offers a lot more opportunities. There's a lot more leagues around the world where you can go and play pro, where before we didn't have that. There's also more recognition than ever before about our role as women in football or as a football players. There's a quick story every time I think about this or I talk about this. I remember once I was traveling with the Colombian national team, and I had like all my clothes from the federation, like my uniform, and the guy from the airport asked me, what do you do? And I said, I play for the Colombian national team. And he's like, women's national team? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, women's national team? And one of my fellow teammates said, do you see her as a man? Or what's the question here? So right now, that recognition is there, and people know about the existence of women's football, and people know that women are professional players. And as you said, I think we are entering an era of global expansion, and there's a lot of investment going on right now, but there's a lot of ongoing struggle also for equality and visibility, because that percentage of how women's sports are seen globally is not really increasing as fast as it should. And there's a lack of respect still on the sports world or in the world about our role in football. So yeah, I think that's a quick but current landscape of where we are right now.
Thank you. And Alex, for you, how do you see the state of the art?
Yeah, I think the unique element that women's football offers, and the change in dynamic that we've seen probably maybe from around 2015 was probably a turning point after the same World Cup that Isabella played in, and you spoke at, Ebro, was that the collective action of players was really, really evident, and the advocacy of players that come together to proactively instigate a change in their game. And I guess an observation working at FIFPro, and also having the privilege to work with players on a day-to-day basis, is that the importance of collective action really can shift the landscape in the game. And an example of this was the work and the negotiation that we had with FIFA on the World Cup for the per player prize money distribution. That was, it was the first time that FIFA have agreed to pay players for their participation. And I think what that demonstrates is two things. One, that when players come together, they can really change the landscape for the better for themselves. And two, that there's an acknowledgement that there is value in the women's game. And I think that brings me to my second point around the unique commercial opportunities that are in women's football now. I think Deloitte did a report very recently at the start of 2024 where they said there's going to be $1 billion industry between like women's basketball and women's football, and 60% of that will be in commercial revenues. And I think that sets us apart from men's football, but it also tells us about the unique elements and how women's football has changed probably in the last 10 years to make it very, very commercially viable. And there are unique elements which make it commercially viable.
Yeah, I think the starting point might be lower, but the growth rate, absolute growth rate, is definitely much higher than any other segment of sport or football. So I've been, tooting the horn for the last decade, and finally, there are more believers now. So you gave a very relevant example of how players are at the center of everything, right? Without players, there's no game. And therefore, their wishes to a certain extent also shape the regulatory environment. Sometimes the regulation leads, but sometimes it's the industry that pushes the boundaries for the regulation. So what do you see as some of the main areas where this industrial development in football could shape the regulatory ecosystem, or vice versa? So maybe, Jan, again, I'd like to start with you. What do you see on your plate and pipeline these days as priorities?
I think there's quite a lot, and I would always emphasize that it's not just us as regulator in this regulating top down. I think we can say, and I do believe that we stepped away from that we as FIFA would just regulate top down. We want to regulate together and in consensus with all our stakeholders, with FIFPro, with ECA, with UEFA, with the World League. So it's a collective effort in the truest sense of the word. And I guess, when you regulate, you can either regulate proactively to shape a bit the industry. If you assume that task, and if you think you have the legitimacy to steer a certain industry in a certain direction, you regulate proactively. That's maybe what we try to do with the minimum labor conditions, to change certain things, to introduce certain things, to hopefully be progressive. And then sometimes you have to, or it's unavoidable that you regulate more reactively, that there's a problem that at some point you hopefully identify, and then you react to that to correct it and to make it go away. And that can also occur also in the women's game. I think there we have one advantage, which is that we have the experience from the men's game. We have seen certain things and certain developments that came from the commercialization of the men's game. And I always say, if we look at the RSTP and the football transfer system that was basically built, as you all know, in 2001, after Bosman and etc., and the agreement with the European Commission, the new RSTP the RCP that was then created. Ever since, if we just look at men's football, things have also changed dramatically. Also, the men's industry has changed dramatically, and we learned from that. And we are in the process of reforming the transfer system, and I hope we will have some learnings there to be better equipped when we regulate reactively also in the women's game at some point. We'll probably have to.
Yeah, I guess on the topic of the transfer system, no consensus currently, I think, among the stakeholders about whether it would be actually prohibitive to implement a system that is similar to the men's system, because maybe free movement at this stage is a bit more important without having to pay compensations or the kind of development fees and things like that. So what are you seeing as sort of the majority view on that front? Because out of the 7 billion annual transfer volume, female players are still no more than about 10, 15 million. It's a tiny amount.
It's a very good question, very interesting one. I have to admit, I don't have the exact data, or I wish I had the exact data to give you an exact answer, and I don't know it at this stage. But you raise an interesting point about the freedom of movement or the possibility to, I don't know if that's probably the wrong term, but to circulate or to move and to develop also on an individual level. I think a practical example there would be training compensation, and of course that's something that is being discussed, training compensation for women's football, what would be a maybe good system, etc. And there, just thinking of free movement, I think in the men's game, there has always been the issue that the fact that a movement of a player triggers the obligation of the new club to pay training compensation to the old club has this so-called hindrance effect. That sometimes exactly that actually hinders the movement of the player, which is completely against the whole idea. And it could be that this is one of the learnings for a system in women's football, that you could say, well, there has been this issue, let's think of ways to mitigate that.
Yeah, I guess the flip side of the argument is then people do not want, or clubs do not want to invest too much in youth development or own youth development, because they'll have their players going away without any training compensation. So it's not an easy debate, obviously, but let's see what FIFPro has to say about regulation, what's missing, what should be coming, what they will be pushing for next, perhaps, in terms of further changes in the regulations.
Yeah, I think like what Jan said, there's lots of progress to be made in women's football, and I think just on the training compensation, there is a system that's being discussed between the stakeholders at the moment on training rewards, which is slightly different to training compensation. And like what you just said, either the 7 billion in annual revenue from transfers, the training compensation will work in particular ways. So the women's training compensation or training rewards will take a proportion of that 7 billion. I think it's 0.6% as being like the rough figure, which would give us around 40 million to pay clubs to train players. So at the moment, what's happening is, and the FAWSL is a really good example of this because Ireland is so close. You've got clubs in Ireland that have just started their own professional league, and when players are getting to like 14, 15, the FAWSL are just coming into their clubs and taking them over to England to play professional football, which for the player is great. For the clubs, it disincentivises them to continue with good training or actually any training at all. And at the moment, like FIFA are leading the way on this, on the training rewards. There'll be a new system in place, and it's different to the men's system where in men's football it's just a professional contract that's signed as a trigger.
Yeah.
In women's football there'll be two triggers, so there'll be a signing of a professional contract, but there'll also be a call up to senior international football, which provides like a unique element that's gender specific. And I think this, there's one really positive outcome, which is that clubs are rewarded for training. But then there's a secondary element, which at FIFA we think that this is super important, is it will force FIFA and the other stakeholders to really define what are professional clubs and what are professional leagues, because that is obviously then when they are remunerated for training players. Because at the moment, the FIFA definition of what is a professional player is not really fit for purpose in women's football, because there's so many nuances to what professional is, and obviously the remuneration and the conditions and the contracts that players have. are short, inconsistent, and insecure workplaces. So I think that this training reward system that that FIFA's leading the way on is going to have like a very, very important impact on the game and the continued sustainable growth of women's football. So that would be one point. And I think the second one, which is really important to us, is the maternity regulation. The one that was established in 2021 is, it's a minimum, it's a baseline.
Yeah.
These 14 weeks is, it's not a lot of time. And I think for us at FIFA, we're working at the moment, we're just finishing the postpartum return to play project, which has some regulatory elements to it, which we've been working on for a year now. So we have kind of a group of expert players who have had children, and then a group of medical experts, and we worked over a process of key focus groups on different subjects, and we produced it's around a 50-page document at the end, which will have some really important implications for the existing regulations on on the maternity. I mean, I could go on, Ebru, there's loads, regulated minimum conditions at tournaments, etc. But I think hitting into what Jan mentioned before in terms of training compensation, and also obviously very gender specific, is the postpartum element of the maternity regulation.
Yeah, and I think from what you have said and the things that I'm seeing both in England, especially in Championship, but also equally in Australia in A-Leagues women, is these definition of professional players and full-time contracts, and that then also triggers the involvement of the respective PFAs, because there is a definition that trickles down that the PFAs are actually covering only the professional players or the professional pyramid. So I think that part is a very important one. And I remember from my ECA days, there was this huge effort that went on for many years for men's players to have a standard contract that was applicable at minimum in every country in the world. And that we're probably at that stage for women's football right now, which is one of the very important, probably, regulatory enforcements that need to happen. And Isabella, sorry, yes, yeah.
Sorry, just because you encouraged us before to interject, I'm not doing
exactly,
it.
Exactly.
I think that the topic of what is actually a professional contract is really an important and an interesting one, and I can only sort of ask the question to myself right now. I don't have the answer, because it is very true that in men's football, as soon as you have a professional contract, that triggers all the whole RSTP, the breach of contract, all those things, and as you all know, the threshold there is very, very, very low. There's no clear-cut figure, but we're speaking of 300 euros, 400 euros, or, and it's really an interesting question to see whether that is the same, not in terms of figures or salary threshold, but in terms of concept, whether that is fit for purpose for the women's game. I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no. It's just to say, it's a very interesting topic.
Definitely. Over to you, Isabella. Your point of view on whether regulation should lead, or whether we as the stakeholders should push for more regulation in certain areas.
I think we as stakeholders should push for regulations in certain areas. I mean, Alex mentioned it briefly, but the fact that many football players across the world signed a petition asking for minimum conditions in the Women's World Cup was huge. That shows us the importance of collective action and the importance of players or stakeholders being at the center of it and asking for better conditions. As you said, the importance of a standard contract is huge, and it's even huge. It's even bigger in different countries across the world, where the minimum standard for players are not being met, but also in big tournaments. So I think we need to take this example of what happened in the Women's World Cup to be able to do it in different tournaments across the world, not only FIFA tournaments, but also at club level, but also at youth level, because that is the only way to ensure not only that the conditions of the players that reach these tournaments are good enough for professional players, but also it's a way to ensure that the pathway to get there will be better, and that is not only one game or 1 week of preparation before the tournament. So I am 100% convinced that we need to take action. We need to lead the way in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree 100% that whatever solutions are found, there needs to be a way for them to trickle down the pyramid. So it's not all about the national team players who are a small minority, let's say, of the overall, female players, who I am very happy that they will be getting equal prize money at the next World Cup, and equal conditions. But there is hundreds of thousands of more players who are working in very dire conditions, and for the love of the game more than anything, always having to have a second, third job, and not getting the kind of support that their male counterparts are getting. So my next question to all of you will be on a topic and the terminology invented by our wonderful Andrea, actually, when we were discussing in preparation for this webinar. I talked about a cliche that we hear a lot. At every single webinar panel, people say, okay, women's football should not follow in the footsteps of men's football. And then I always say, okay, great, I agree, but what are the things that we need to leave behind? So there are some good things about men's football that can be brought in and replicated in women's football, but what are the things we need to leave behind and not make the same kind of mistakes? So Andrea, when he listened to me, he said, you're talking about positive subtraction. So let's talk about positive subtractions.
For the sake of IP rights, I really appreciate the mention.
Yes, of course.
But the substance is even more important.
Of course. So let's change the order this time. Let's start with Isabella. What would you subtract positively from the men's game and not bring into the women's game?
Well, that's a really good question.
Maybe I'll challenge you and also say with your media hat on, because it's not just the player side, but you also have this media hat now. So maybe think about the broadcasting side of it and social media side of it as well.
Yeah, I was going to mention the behavior of the fans in the stadiums and of the stadiums. I think right now men's football has a very abusive culture in the stadium. There's a lot of violence that we see everywhere in the world by now. And I think one thing that is different in women's football is that the experience of the fans in the stadium is different. So if we can keep that positive vibe in the stadiums for women's football, that family-friendly side, that respectful way of seeing the game, I would be very happy if we don't replicate what men's football is doing in that sense. And that applies also to social media and to the media, right? Because when we go into social media, or a lot of the times when we hear media outlets speaking about players, they do it without thinking there's a human that behind the player, right? That the human behind the player is being hurt by the comments, is being hurt by people just saying whatever they want to say on social media. And if we can somehow not replicate what's going on in men's football in that sense, and in sports in general in that sense, that would also be very helpful. And from a media perspective, I think we need to replicate the amount of news and the amount of visibility that men's players get, right? Because we don't hear that enough. But I don't know how to. Yeah, I think we need to replicate that. We need more visibility. We need more real stories, and we need to put the players' athletic ability in the center of it all, while also telling their personal stories. But we need to identify that there's an athlete there, and you need to showcase their strengths.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I liked Isabella's answer as well. That was good, Isa. I guess my observations and my experiences is that at the moment we try and like, there's women's football and everyone's like, oh, we don't really know what to do with this. Like, we know that it's good and we know that it will be good because like the data indicates this, and like what you said at the start, Ibra, the room for growth, whatever growth is like much greater than in men's football. But then there's like one governance system that governs it all without the gendered specific knowledge in key positions to make key decisions for a game that has unique elements. So apart from being like 11v11 and all playing in stadiums, women's and men's football is like very, very different. It's a very different sport. It's got different characteristics. The people and the, like I said before, the solidarity and the advocacy it is one thing in the women's game, like a characteristics. And then you've obviously got the men's game, which is a bit more of an entitled system, where you have one governance system. And I think that governance system doesn't actually work for women's football. So if I was to like dream big, I guess it would be to have a completely independent governance system for women's football. I just don't think at the moment that the governance system, in whatever shape or form it takes, is really fit for purpose, and I don't think it meets the needs of the players or the industry, and I don't think it's got the innovative ways of thinking to actually grow the game to its capacity. So I think I would leave behind the governance system. That would be my one big thing that I think would open up endless possibilities in terms of like commercial, in terms of professionalization, in terms of establishing and maintaining a sustainable game and growth that provides professional opportunities and careers for women for many, many years.
Okay, that's great. I agree that I wouldn't bring the governance system as it is, but I'll play devil's advocate, and actually I think there is a big need to reform the governance system for overall football, for men's football as well. And I think the decision-making bodies, unfortunately, are not very inclusive currently. And how you get to power is not based on merit, right? It's a difficult system, and the boards are not necessarily meant to be high-performing boards. So it's not like a corporate board. $1 billion company in another industry is much more selective about who sits on their decision-making bodies, and ensuring that there is a skills gap analysis and people are selected based on their, what they can contribute to that board. But an election system doesn't always produce the same kind of result. So I think the solution that we as women in football have called for since last summer, on the back of all the events that happened in Spain after the World Cup, is more independent board members, whether it's at the regulator level, whether it's at the league level, whether it's the national association level, because whenever you bring in people based on merit to work together with insiders from the industry, I think it definitely improves the quality of decision making, and you can also question the allocation of resources, which currently are definitely not fairly allocated, to the detriment of women's football, obviously. So Jan, what would you leave behind, or what would you bring in?
I would say first that, with all the challenges and all the issues that we're facing in men's football, we should still not forget that men's football has brought a lot of joy to many boys and girls, and has had great positive impacts on society, on health, and there's a lot of positive things, and we would want all of those, and they will be there in the women's game, of course, but just to really make that point also, there have been many positive impacts coming from men's football for a long time ago. It's uncontestable that there are issues when it comes to, for example, integrity, disciplinary, doping, match fixing, all these things you wouldn't want, obviously. I like most also that the point that Isabella made, and I would agree with that the respectful atmosphere and the respectful and the absolutely not abusive atmospheres, even sometimes that things that we see in men's football in that area. Obviously, that's this respectful atmosphere in the women's game is absolutely amazing and something that always affects me very much, because I'm really impressed with it. I don't know if in men's football it has to do with the levels of testosterone. I don't know. It's that is certainly something that where everyone should learn, in a sense, and go and see a women's football match and what the atmosphere is like.
Definitely. So I'll add to that list two things, actually. One is I would bring in the willingness to make a loss. On men's football side, everybody's happy to make a loss, right? With the hope that they will win a cup and in the end go to Champions League and make more money and recover that loss. But on women's football, unfortunately, it's always, well, we can only spend as much as we make. We're not willing to pay forward. We're not willing to invest forward. So I really would love that mentality of men's side to be courageous enough to invest and not expect an immediate profit. And the second thing I would add to it is I managed a negative cash flow football club for 15 years, unfortunately. And I actually, as a finance person, saw financial fair play and the follow-on financial sustainability regulations as a blessing, actually. So I think the absence of any kind of financial regulation for women's football is not a good idea. And I know that it doesn't have to be as onerous maybe as the men's football side, but some kind of minimum rules and regulations is going to help further professionalize the game. So I think that's something we need to bring in a phased out approach into women's football as well. So for our webinar participants, we're going to continue for another 5-10 minutes because we want to also hear from you. And if you have any questions, you can drop it in the chat, which I'm not sure if I'm able to see the questions or not. But if you have any questions to any of the participants or myself, can you please write them in the chat so I can direct them to the relevant person? Oh yes, Q&A, here we go. From Karthik Mandana, after the disappointing decision of the France Football Federation banning players who choose to wear the Islamic headscarf during matches, do you believe that such a decision from a powerful footballing nation will influence other countries in their regulation of women's football? Who would like to take this question?
I mean, Jan, do you want to go first? I've got some thoughts, but
yeah, I think will it influence other countries in the regulation of women's football? It may be. I don't know. It's decisions coming from one country. If whenever it's a big country, it may have a certain impact. It may also create certain counter reactions. At the end, I don't know.
Alex, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the Islamic headscarf's been banned in France actually for 10 years, I think, by the government. So I think inevitably that filters down into football decision-making bodies to act in a kind of unified way with the country, or actually to disrupt and not act in the same way as a matter of principle. So I think the banning of headscarves, particularly like in women's football, I can't see it being a trigger for other countries to take the same extreme measures, because obviously they're discriminatory in essence. And I think if that become, like, let's say, a trend in women's football, I would like to think that the players would collectively stand up against this, because it's an infringement on human rights, for one. And I think for two, it really goes against the values that drive women's football. So, I mean, I can't say yes or no for sure, but I can give like a contextual answer that I think really would impact the players and their understanding. I can give you an example. Recently, we had a call with a couple of players who played in a professional team, and their club asked them to go and play an exhibition game in Saudi Arabia. And the players came together within this club and actually the opposition and said, we don't want to play in Saudi as women, women who are of the LGBT community. We think that this would actually go against the values that we hold dear and that are the glue for women's football. It was a similar thing when in the US women's national team recently, when one of the players were called up that was transphobic and homophobic. So I think actually women's football has got a set of values that it guides the players, and I think France hopefully is an outlier in this regressive policy that is implemented by the federation and also the government.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there should be no barriers to entry for any kind of person to play or to work in football. So that should be the starting principle of any decision. And unfortunately, that's not the case everywhere. The second question is directed at me, specifically to Turkey. How can we tackle toxicity induced by male governors in Turkish women's football scene? We had horrible instances this season, not only in women's football, in men's football as well, unfortunately. And again, I think that it's more about having a strong federation with the determination to solve the long outstanding issues, whether it's improving the quality of refereeing or whether it's creating a more collaborative environment for clubs to work together to generate growth for the country. It always makes me very sad that we are the 6th or 7th largest revenue generating nation in Turkey in terms of football. But unfortunately, our performances, international viewership, or our visibility as an international, important brand has not grown in parallel to the revenues that we generate in the country. But I think it all starts with better and more professional federation management. The third question again comes from Karthik. What are the ways in which male footballers can help support the growth of women's football? This is a very important question, I think. Isabella, do you want to start us on that?
Can you repeat the question, Ibu, please?
What are the ways in which male footballers can help support the growth of women's football?
Oh, that's a good question. I agree with you. Yeah. I mean, as simple as just being more vocal about it and just supporting their fellow players, supporting their fellow teammates at their clubs. You most often don't see men's players speaking about women's football. They tend not to engage a lot, and if they are able to use their platforms and their voices to get people more involved into women's football, and also within the clubs, they are seeing how women are training in different facilities, in different fields, have different sets of standards within their own clubs. They could be a voice inside, and a very powerful voice inside, to help us change those small details that at the end are going to mean a lot for a player and are going to improve the professionalism of the game.
Yeah, definitely. That visibility you talked about earlier on, and also providing that solidarity. And I even sometimes say, when I get asked to moderate a session or speak on a panel, I always ask the conference, are there other women, right? Why am I the only one on that panel? Or we challenge a lot of the times those panels which don't have any women, because automatically assumption is if you're women, you work in women's football or you talk about women's football. No, it should be anyone who is capable or who is interested should be able to work in any part of the game. Does anyone want to add anything to the role of male footballers? How they can help support the growth of women's football? Alex, I think you want to say.
Yeah, I think, again, it's like as I said, and I think you said it as well, Ebro, it's a really important question. I think allyship in general, like societal allyship, is such an important concept for continued progress of society and all kind of marginalised groups, let's say. And I think for me, an acknowledgement of privilege is always a good place to start for men, particularly men who are white, heterosexual, and cisgendered. And I think once there is like an education process that started, and I think that process has already started with some good demonstrations of allyship, I think that's it's an important facet of it. But I also think, like, from a media perspective and from a societal perspective, I think men are often maybe want to say something, but they don't because they fear the backlash that is put on them after they say something like maybe supportive of women's football. And I think Joey Barton, I don't know if anyone follows him or like the tirade that he's been going on about like having women speaking on men's football. And, he's just a misogynist, he's sexist, he's etc. And he's using this kind of like keep women out of men's football as a mask. And I found it really interesting that like no men have like said, even just like shut up, you're like you're embarrassing yourself. And it's because they fear the backlash. And I think that is a real sad indictment of where we are as a society, that people probably feel like they want to, demonstrate some allyship, but actually their careers are at risk as a consequence, or, their social media abuse is going to proliferate. So I think there's one thing of like encouraging male allyship, but also you've got to think about the consequences to them as well. And I think it's a pretty sad moment when you can't demonstrate allyship because of a backlash.
Yeah. I think, showing your values actually is a very important way, or living by your values is very important. And we don't, as you say, always see it. There's one more question from Williams Emoni. The media should play a critical role in the development of women's football. In Africa, women's football does not have publicity like their male counterpart. William, you know what? It's the same everywhere in the world. It's not just Africa. I think England is making some strides. I think there is now significantly more media coverage, but I think the rest of the world certainly suffers from that. What is the solution, dear panelists, you think? How do we get more coverage in the media?
I want to say something there, Ibru, because it's not only Africa. I think yesterday or 2 days ago, Aitana Bonmati, World Cup champion, the best player in the world, said, we won the World Cup and nothing changed. Things are the same here. We're not getting any more media, any more visibility. The league is not improving. But I think she said it on that note, that England won the Euros and all of a sudden women's football was everywhere, but it didn't happen in Spain. So I just wanted to share that little note there, because not even the world champions are seeing the change that they should be seeing in their country.
Yeah. But again, maybe the solution is not to rely on the traditional media, right? And create your own channels. And, if you're unable to have live broadcast of a full match, just work on the highlights and get, because we are in women's football trying to get a younger and more different audience, and the needs of that audience is actually somewhat different. Yes, Andrea, please come in.
Well, Ebru, I just wanted to say I have two final questions at the end, but they are from me.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well,
shall I go?
Okay.
Well, maybe a naive one, but it touches upon, because sometimes we want to talk about the evolution of women's football from the roof, but even at the floor stage, let's say, there are very basic things. And I mentioned that to Ebru in the past. I'm in disbelief. I can still see clear production of boots for female players. I think that's a very basic, somewhat naive observation, and sometimes and that goes in the direction of the last question that you probably wanted to read, whether the rules of the game should change due to some sort of physical specificity of female players. On that one, I'm personally a little bit skeptical, and I don't think that Isabella and all players would like to see some different rule of the games. But yes, on technical tools, I would like to see some evolution from the industry as well, even in terms of having those, and I talked to Ian and Ebru, some sort of positive induction from federations in having contracts with technical brands, imposing some sort of development, if ever possible. And the second question is whether it makes some sense to allocate part of the proceedings deriving from economic sanctions imposed by FIFA to specific development activities in women's football, or if that idea is strategically offensive and we need a progression and evolution by way of organic and natural growth rather than the allocation of sanctions.
Great two questions there. Who wants to take a crack at them?
I can go first if you want on the last part of having mandatory rules on how money should be allocated. That's probably practically not so easy to implement. Whether FIFA really has the right to go and tell member associations this is how you have to spend your money is probably not easy to implement. But the way how this could work, and maybe it's an idea, is rather through incentives, in the sense that, to be entitled to receive development money, you have to demonstrate that you have certain projects dedicated to the development of women's football. That's probably a way how this could work. And the other questions, I guess, are more technical, and I'm definitely not the expert.
Yeah. Alex, Isabella?
Do you want to go first?
I think she's saying you go first, Alex.
Okay. I think on the last question, in terms of like the mandatory rules on how money should be spent, I think that there is opportunity to impose such rules, and they can be incentivized, like what Jan said. I think a really good example of this is the work that FIFA has just done with UEFA on developing a minimum standards framework. And we worked on this for the last year or so. And basically we, in collaboration with UEFA, developed minimum standards for national team assemblies, but they will, when federations meet these standards, they are incentivized by €100,000 per year, and it's a 4-year program. And it works on the basis of obviously one, incentivizing, but also raising the minimum standards for more developing countries. And I think it's like the rising tide raises all boats, doesn't it? So once there's more federations who are able to put teams on the pitch to compete competitively in European championships, in World Cups, I think you will see natural, like a domino effect of the growth of professionalisation, the increase of the capacity for clubs to have employment. So I think, yes, federations and clubs should be incentivised exactly in the means that they're incentivised by. It can come in different forms. The UEFA minimum standards is just one example. And I think on the question, if I understood it correctly in terms of like the technicalities of adapting rules specifically for women's football, I do think that question is fairly discriminatory in nature, because I think like for all of the while, like what we understand women to be is, and how women's football is understood is, they're established as like quote unquote little men. So I think that kind of question falls in line with that a little bit. And I think there's often talk around goalkeepers, being able to reach the crossbar or being able to kick to the halfway line. And I remember when I started playing football, and the goalkeepers were particularly an issue, because not because of the size of them or the capabilities, but actually because of the level of coaching. So I think we can zoom out a little bit, and rather than changing the technicalities of the game and shortening the pitch or like playing with a size 4 ball, I think what we can do is actually properly invest in the women's game and the coaches and the multidisciplinary teams that surround the players, the conditions in which they play in. And I think the examples of that where it's been done really, really well, or, well comparatively, the NWSL, the FAWSL, teams like England, teams like the US, I don't think, Alyssa Nair or Mary Earps needs a smaller goal. I think what she just needed was like really good coaches that give her the time and the ability to be a professional footballer and be coached by high performance coaches. That's just my opinion. Yeah. I don't know if you've got.
I agree with that view. Actually, there was another question in the chat that was elaborating Andrea's question, which you also answered. Paula was asking, is it worth talking about changing some rules of the sport, size of goals, balls, or could just such changes be viewed in a negative manner? I think the general view, especially probably coming from the player side, would be that it would be a negative manner, most probably, right?
Yeah, I was just to clarify, I was reading that question. I just commented that I was personally skeptical about it.
Right. I know.
I was very skeptical about it, and I was more focusing on the boots.
Yeah.
But on the boots, I would still like a reaction on the boots, because I'm in disbelief.
If you want, I'll quickly address it, because you are right. There was never a real woman's boot, and that was seen as an opportunity by a great investor, Laura Youngson, Ida Sports, and she went after basically the big producers, trying to convince them that it's not just a smaller size of a men's shoe, but the women's anatomy is different. It's, women's needs are different, and there needs to be a completely different design and a I don't know what you call it, the number one boot, which is like used as the model for the rest of the production. And ECA also conducted some studies on that. And the outcome of the study was given to all the boot manufacturers for free to use as the model feet. I'm sure, Isa, you have some views on that.
Yeah, I was going to say also, I was going to mention Ida as well. I think it's the only brand right now who's focusing on women's cleats. And there's certainly a very big necessity of development in this area. But I think also not only in the developing on the shoe itself, but also the accessibility that players need to get their proper boots in order to perform. If we think about it, when you enter a job outside of football or whatever, you're given a laptop and maybe a phone because you need those things to perform your job. Yeah. But when you're a football player, nobody gives you cleats for free, or your team is not saying, here, this is what you need to perform well. So that is also another key area for me, because cleats are very expensive, and the salaries of the players are a lot of the times not too high. So it's on the developing side and figuring out what is the best way for the women, for women to wear the cleats, but also having that accessibility into players is key from me. And I wanted to go back to for a moment when you were speaking about the media and not relying on the traditional channels. The power is here. Oh, you cannot see my phone. Okay, there it is, my phone. The power is here, not only for players, but for the ecosystem as a whole. And if we're able to share more news, we're able to speak more about it, if the players are more trained to build on their social media, on their personal brand, that is going to be key. And that is going to be the future of football, because young generations are not interested in watching 90 minutes of football.
Yeah.
You know, and that's another key area in which we need to rely on in order to build what the future of women's football and football looks like.
Perfect. Let's wrap up with a final question and a short answer from each of you. So if you had a magic wand where you could bring one thing, a solution to women's football to unlock the potential, you know, what is the first thing you would do with that magic wand?
I would change the leadership.
Good. Jan, what about you?
Make more resources available for the training of young female players.
Excellent. Alex?
I would standardize conditions across professional football.
Andrea, do you want the wand for a second?
I'm fine. I said enough.
Okay.
I'll say boots again.
Okay.
It's the basic. Let's start from the basics.
Yeah. For me, I would find and bring in about $1 billion into the industry and distribute it for growth.
Yeah.
Bravo.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, to our amazing panelists, Jan, Alex, and Isabella. Thank you, Andrea, for inviting us, and also to our great webinar attendees. Thank you for staying on and listening to us. We hope you enjoyed and learned something from our views and experiences, and hope to see you on another occasion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
We loved it.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.